the country. Its report was presented to the Federal Minister of Indigenous Affairs earlier this month. Co-authors Professor Pat Dudgeon and Gerry Georgatos joined me from earlier from Perth. Professor Pat Dudgeon, Gerry Georgatos, welcome to Lateline. It's a national cause of concern that the leading cause of death for Australians aged 15 to 24 is suicide. But the suicide rate is 4 times that for Indigenous people in the same category. Professor Dudgeon, what's driving that?
Oh, look, there's a lot of things that are contributing to the suicide rates. You know, there's common things between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, but in an Indigenous situation, you do need to put what's happened in our country, that history of colonisation and the social determinants that have happened as a consequence of that. Poverty, unemployment, lack of access to good education, and in some communities, lack of a lot of activities and a denial of cultural activities. So there's clinical factors in there as well, but there's quite a number of different important contributing factors.
Gerry, you were one of the people that were responsible for this ATSIS PEP report on Indigenous suicide and involved you touring 12 areas that had particularly troubling rates of suicide. Was there something similar to all of those regions?
We visited 6 demographical areas, and we also had 6 other roundtables, so 12 roundtables in total around the nation. And there were pronounced commonalities that included, for instance, the poverty, the socioeconomic poverty of an acute nature and the constancy of trauma within that poverty that's pronounced. 40% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live below the poverty line. More than 90% of the suicides are from within the 40% who live below the poverty line. And for many of them, it's third world akin, it's dirt poor poverty. There's a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. That's what was most pronounced from the 12 roundtables that we held around the nation, and the responses need to be targeted to them. So what we need in terms of funding is a triage basis of targeted funding on a needs basis of greatest need to those who are poorest amongst us, and a sense of hopelessness and helplessness that far too many are living from near the beginning of life. Let us remind ourselves that 30% of all Australia's child suicides to the age of 17 are of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, and that's an abomination, moral, political and otherwise. The nation should weep. The nation should weep at that stark and grim statistic.
In Tierney's piece, we saw 4 graves of people who died in a short period of time in the same area. Why does sometimes one suicide lead to another?
International research shows that if there's one suicide, that opens the possibility for others to consider that as an option in their lives. So I think that services need to move in quickly and to ensure that people aren't feeling vulnerable, because dealing with the grief and but all the other issues in your life that would make you vulnerable become more pronounced.
Yeah, you were saying in the report that of all the strategies that you evaluated that worked, it was the ones that were led by Indigenous people that were most effective. So is that because they were the front customer-focused face of it, or were they the strategies that they devised that worked?
Look, with any group of people, Indigenous or other groups, you need to have people as to be an active part of determining what the issue is, what the solution should be, and how to deliver that. And for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, it has been historical that they haven't been in charge of our own affairs. So in suicide prevention, it absolutely is fundamental that there's Indigenous inclusion and all throughout whatever activity takes place. So that's important. Number 1, self-determination, Indigenous inclusion. Number 2 is that there are cultural differences, and if Indigenous communities are part of coming up with identifying the problem and creating solutions, informed solutions, it will have the cultural element that it will need to have.
Professor, the amount of federal funding has risen markedly over the past 20 years. Like, the national strategies have gone from a few $1 million worth to over $100 million worth. And yet, why is nothing working?
I think we're about to see some reform. Certainly the ATSIPAP report has actual flowchart or evaluation tool that helps funding. And if it's done in the right way, we can spend a lot of money, but if we're not doing it in the right way in involving communities at all different levels, I think our resources will not be as effective. So we do have a very solid plan on how to include Indigenous people in whatever suicide activity gets funded, and I think there will be considerable change. It may not be overnight, but I think we can turn the situation around.
Gerry, do you think there needs to be key performance indicators so that if one strategy is not working on lowering the rate of suicide, then they quickly need to move to something else?
The ATSIPAP project was more than just report building. It also built an evaluation tool. So Professor Pat Dudgeon led the building of an evaluation tool, which was a first time, and in terms of being endorsed by Prime Minister and Cabinet and the federal government. So it'll go to what actually works in the space and measure the indicators that need to be met in terms of potential funding for projects and in terms of ongoing investment in those projects. And that will then go to certainty of funding around programs. We've got a lot of complaints from people right around the country, a sameness of these complaints from right around the nation about programs being cut, about funding uncertainty. If we get the evaluation tool up and running as a blueprint, as the federal government at this time has promised, then we begin to authenticate the space and the suicide prevention space and validate what works in the space. And that's what we actually want, to see what works, to continue to be rolled out, and for much more of that to follow from those signature piece programs that actually are working. And from that evaluation tool will be threaded a lot of the other recommendations that we fight forever and a day to get up and running. We've had many reports in the past with recommendations that haven't been implemented. The evaluation tool, if implemented, will obviously thread a lot of those recommendations that we've also put up, that others have put up in the past. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership of the space and workforce parity is vital to that. And often when that doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen to the extent that it should have, it translates toxically as racism. And racism is a huge and compounding factor for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in not just the suicide prevention space, but all layers of Aboriginal rights issues.
I'm going to have to leave it there, but Gerry Georgatos, Professor Pat Dudgeon, thank you so much for being on Lateline.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you.